I guess I should start by saying that I never thought my marriage would end up as a cautionary tale. I'm John, 35, from Ohio, born and raised in a town where men are men, hard work is respected, and family means everything. At least, that's how I was raised to see things. I met Claire during my senior year of college. She was sharp, funny, and a knockout in every sense of the word. Marrying her felt like the easiest decision I'd ever made. But looking back, I can't help but wonder if I missed the cracks forming beneath the surface. Our marriage started strong. I had a steady job in logistics, Claire worked in marketing, and we settled into suburban life in a decent neighborhood with neighbors who waved at you when they mowed their lawns. For a while, it felt like I was living the dream my parents always talked about. We laughed a lot, we traveled when we could, and every Friday night, we'd cook dinner together. Her with a glass of wine, me nursing a beer. It was ordinary but perfect. But then, things started shifting. I didn't notice it at first. It was subtle, like a low hum in the background you can't place. Claire began to bring up kids, when we'd have them, how we'd raise them. At first, I was all for it. I mean, that's the next step, right? Build a family, raise a couple of kids, and teach them the same values my dad taught me. It wasn't until the topic of birth control came up that I realized we were on entirely different wavelengths. "John," she said one night after dinner, swirling the last bit of wine in her glass, "I think we need to talk about this whole family planning thing." "What's there to talk about?" I replied, almost joking. "We let nature do its thing." That's where it started. Her frustration, my stubbornness. I've always been dead set against contraceptives. I can't explain it in a way that doesn't sound ridiculous now, but at the time, it felt like a principle I couldn't compromise on. I saw it as unnatural, as interfering with something sacred. I told Claire as much, and she didn't take it well. "I'm not just a baby machine, John," she said one night, her voice sharp but tired. "We need to think about this together. It's my body, my health." I don't know why I dug my heels in so hard. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe I just didn't want to admit that I could be wrong. The more she pushed, the more I resisted. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about winning, about standing my ground. The first real sign of trouble came when Claire started avoiding intimacy. She didn't say it outright, but it was obvious. The touches, the playful banter, the nights we'd fall asleep tangled together. It all faded. At first, I thought she was just stressed from work. But then I noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way she'd flinch when I tried to kiss her, the excuses she'd make when I suggested we go to bed early. I didn't handle it well. I grew resentful, bitter. I accused her of being distant, of not trying hard enough to keep our connection alive. I didn't realize that I was the one building the wall between us brick by brick. Looking back, there were moments when I could have fixed it. Moments when I could have listened, really listened, instead of turning everything into a debate. But I didn't. I was so sure that I was right, so convinced that I was doing what was best for both of us. And then came the night that changed everything. Claire had been working late more often, claiming deadlines and meetings, but it felt off. She was always careful with her appearance, but lately, it was different. New perfume, a fresh haircut, clothes I hadn't seen her wear in years. It wasn't like her to be this meticulous for work. One evening, after another excuse about staying late, I caught a whiff of something on her coat as she draped it over the chair. It wasn't her usual floral perfume. It was masculine, sharp, the kind you'd find in a magazine ad. "Who is it?" I asked her, my voice colder than I intended. She looked at me, startled. "What are you talking about?" "That cologne," I said, stepping closer. "It's not yours, and it sure as hell isn't mine." For the first time in our marriage, she didn't have an answer. She just stood there, looking at me like a deer caught in headlights. And in that moment, I knew. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark living room, my mind racing. The signs had been there for months. Her distance, the late nights, the tension between us. I just didn't want to see it. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was the realization that I'd played a part in driving her away. I'd pushed her into a corner with my stubbornness, my refusal to compromise. And now, I was left wondering if I'd lost her for good. As the sun rose, casting pale light over the room, I knew I had to confront her. But what scared me the most wasn't her confession. It was the possibility that even if she stayed, we might never find our way back to each other. This chapter is a personal recount of John's early realization of the cracks in his marriage and sets the stage for further revelations and conflicts. Would you like me to continue or explore another angle? If you've ever watched sand slip through your fingers, you'll understand what my marriage felt like during those months. I couldn't pinpoint when it started, exactly, when Claire began pulling away. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but once I noticed, I couldn't unsee it. The days were easy enough to get through. We both worked full-time jobs and had our routines down to a science. She'd leave early, usually before I'd finished my second cup of coffee, and I'd head out an hour later. By the time we were both home, it felt like the bare minimum. A quick dinner, maybe an hour of TV, and then her disappearing upstairs to get a head start on tomorrow. At first, I didn't think much of it. Work had always been important to Claire. She was ambitious, one of the many things I admired about her when we first met. I told myself that this was just her leaning into a big project or gunning for a promotion. The late nights, the vague answers about what she'd been working on. It all had a plausible explanation. I wanted to believe it, but there was this nagging feeling I couldn't shake, like a splinter in the back of my mind. It wasn't just the late nights. It was the way she started to slip out of our shared moments. She used to be the one to insist we eat dinner at the table instead of in front of the TV. Now she barely looked up from her plate. We used to talk about our days, venting about our bosses, laughing about stupid office drama. That stopped too. Conversations turned into perfunctory exchanges. How was your day? Fine. Yours? Fine. It wasn't fine, though. I could feel the distance between us growing, and the more I tried to close it, the wider it seemed to stretch. One night, I suggested we go out for dinner. It wasn't a special occasion or anything. I just thought maybe a change of scenery would shake us out of whatever rut we were in. Claire agreed, but her enthusiasm felt hollow. At the restaurant, she barely touched her food, her eyes darting to her phone every few minutes. "What's going on with you?" I asked finally, trying to keep my tone light but firm. "Nothing," she said, too quickly. "Just a lot on my mind." I nodded, even though her answer didn't satisfy me. I told myself not to push, but I couldn't stop wondering what, exactly, was on her mind that she couldn't share with me. I started noticing other things, too. Small, insignificant details that added up in ways I didn't want to acknowledge. She'd gotten a new perfume, something light and floral, different from her usual scent. I might not have thought twice about it if she hadn't also started dressing a little sharper, a little trendier. I remember watching her head out the door one morning, heels clicking against the hardwood floor, and thinking she looked like a stranger. I felt stupid for even entertaining the idea that there might be someone else. Claire wasn't that kind of person. At least, I didn't think she was. And yet, the signs were there. Her late nights at the office stretched later and later. When I asked if she wanted me to wait up for her, she'd wave me off. "Don't bother," she'd say. "I'll probably be home after midnight." She started working weekends, too, something she'd never done before. The excuse was always the same: big deadline. I believed her because I wanted to, but deep down, I could feel something shifting. I tried to rationalize it. Every couple goes through rough patches, right? Marriage is supposed to ebb and flow. Maybe this was just one of those times when life gets in the way, when work and stress and everyday obligations push you apart for a while. But the distance between us didn't feel like something natural. It felt like a wall she was building, brick by brick, while I stood on the other side trying to figure out why. I thought about confronting her outright, but what would I even say? I didn't have any concrete proof that something was wrong. And what if I was wrong? What if I accused her of something she wasn't doing? The thought of planting that kind of doubt between us made me hesitate. So, I waited. I watched. I hoped things would go back to normal, but they didn't. One night, I came home from work to find her sitting on the couch, laptop open, papers spread out around her. She looked up when I walked in, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Long day?" I asked, dropping my keys on the counter. "Yeah," she said, her voice distant. "I've got to finish this report before tomorrow. Don't wait up." I stood there for a moment, watching her type away, her focus completely elsewhere. I wanted to ask her if she even noticed how far apart we'd grown, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I poured myself a drink and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the clock on the wall and wondering how much longer I could ignore the feeling that my marriage was slipping through my fingers. This chapter captures the narrator's growing realization of the emotional and physical distance in his marriage, blending subtle details and reflections to keep readers intrigued about what happens next. Let me know if you'd like me to continue. I didn't plan to snoop. That's not who I am. Or at least it wasn't who I thought I was. But life has a funny way of forcing you to confront parts of yourself you didn't know existed. I was looking for my gym bag, which I was sure I'd left by the front door. Claire was at work, and the house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. That's when I saw it. A scarf draped over the arm of the couch. It was Claire's scarf, one I'd seen a dozen times before. A navy blue with small white polka dots, nothing flashy. But when I picked it up, I noticed something off. A scent clung to it. Not her perfume, not mine. It was sharp and woodsy, distinctly masculine. I froze, the fabric clutched in my hand, my mind scrambling for an explanation. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she'd borrowed it to a friend, or picked it up after it had fallen somewhere. But the thoughts kept coming, uninvited and relentless. Who wears cologne like that? Why would it be on her scarf? That night, I couldn't concentrate on anything. We were eating dinner, grilled chicken and roasted vegetables, one of her go-to meals, and I kept glancing at her, searching for, what? A crack in her demeanor? A guilty look? She seemed fine, normal even. She smiled as she told me about her day, but I wasn't really listening. The next morning, I saw something else. She was getting dressed for work, standing in front of the mirror in our bedroom, smoothing down her skirt. That's when I noticed it, a faint bruise on the inside of her left thigh. It was small but unmistakable, a dark purple mark that stood out against her fair skin. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "What happened to your leg?" She glanced down, barely pausing. "Oh, that? I must have bumped into something at work." Her answer came so quickly, so effortlessly, that I almost believed it. Almost. But something about the way she said it, the way she didn't even look at me as she spoke, sent a chill down my spine. I didn't say anything else, but my mind was racing. A bruise like that? It wasn't the kind of thing you get from bumping into a desk. For the rest of the day, I tried to shake the thoughts, tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. But they clung to me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about the cologne, the bruise, the late nights at work. The signs were piling up, and no matter how much I wanted to ignore them, I couldn't. That evening, I confronted her. "Claire," I said as she was putting away her laptop, "I need to ask you something." She looked up, her brow furrowed. "What is it?" I hesitated, my stomach in knots. "That cologne on your scarf, it's not yours, and it's not mine. And that bruise on your leg, it doesn't look like something you'd get from work." Her face changed in an instant, her expression hardening. "Are you seriously accusing me of something right now?" "I'm not accusing you," I said, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. I need to understand what's going on." She crossed her arms, her eyes flashing. "You're imagining things, John. I told you. I bumped into something at work. And as for the scarf, maybe someone brushed against me on the subway. I don't know." Her words were sharp, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was deflecting. I wanted to believe her, to let it go and move on. But something inside me, call it instinct, call it intuition, told me there was more to the story. That night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, the weight of suspicion pressing down on me. I didn't want to be the kind of man who doubted his wife, who saw shadows where there were none. But the evidence was there, staring me in the face, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I don't know what I was looking for that day. Maybe it was something as mundane as my phone charger or a stray sock that had gone missing in the laundry. It doesn't really matter now, does it? What I found instead was the kind of thing that knocks the wind out of you, leaves you reeling like you just stepped out of a bar fight you didn't know you were in. It started when I opened Claire's tote bag. She'd left it on the kitchen counter the night before, probably in a rush after one of her late-night meetings. It wasn't like me to go through her stuff. Hell, I'd always been the guy who prided himself on respecting boundaries. But something about the way she'd rushed off that morning, barely saying goodbye, gnawed at me. I told myself it wasn't snooping if I was just looking for the charger. That's what I told myself, right up until I saw the corner of a piece of paper sticking out from one of the inside pockets. It wasn't a random scrap or a grocery list. It was crisp, printed on heavy stock paper, the kind hotels use for receipts. For a second, I didn't move. I just stared at it, like I was waiting for it to disappear, for reality to reset itself. When it didn't, I pulled the receipt out and unfolded it with trembling hands. There it was, clear as day. The name of a hotel downtown, a date, and a time. The date stood out immediately because it was one of the nights she told me she was working late. The time? Checkout was just after 11 a.m. the following day. My heart started racing. I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me cold and lightheaded. I sat down at the kitchen table, the receipt still clutched in my hand, and stared at it like it might suddenly tell me I was wrong. There was no name listed other than hers, Claire Thompson. No room service charges or anything obvious like that. Just the basic details, the room number, the date, the check-in and check-out times. But that was enough. In the back of my mind, I started grasping for explanations. Maybe it was for work. Maybe she'd been attending a conference or meeting a client. But that didn't make sense. Claire worked in marketing, not finance or sales. And even if it was for work, why hadn't she mentioned it? I replayed the conversation we'd had that night, trying to remember if there'd been any hints, any signs I should have picked up on. She'd called me around 7 p.m., saying she'd be home late. "Don't wait up," she'd said. "It's going to be a long one." I hadn't thought twice about it then. Now, though, it felt like everything was unraveling. I sat there for what felt like an hour, the receipt on the table in front of me, my mind a mess of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Anger, disbelief, heartbreak. They all fought for space, each one louder than the last. But underneath it all was this gnawing sense of dread, this sinking feeling that I already knew the truth, even if I didn't want to admit it. When Claire came home that evening, I tried to play it cool. I didn't want to confront her right away, not without thinking things through. But the sight of her, calm, composed, acting like everything was normal, made my blood boil. "How was work?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "Busy," she replied, slipping off her heels. "Same as always." I nodded, watching her closely. If she noticed anything off about me, she didn't show it. For the rest of the night, I couldn't focus on anything. Not dinner, not the TV show we half-watched together. My mind kept drifting back to that receipt, to the date and time printed in stark black ink. When she went to bed, I stayed up, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of whiskey in front of me. The receipt was still there, mocking me, daring me to do something about it. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers. But part of me was terrified of what she might say. What if she denied it? Worse, what if she didn't? What if she looked me in the eye and admitted everything? By the time I finally crawled into bed, it was nearly 2 a.m. Claire was already asleep, her breathing slow and steady. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The receipt had confirmed what I'd been too afraid to acknowledge until now. Something was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. And no matter how much I wanted to pretend otherwise, I couldn't unsee it. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay there, wondering what the hell I was supposed to do next. I never thought I'd be that guy, the one sitting alone in his car, staring at the glow of his phone, piecing together clues about his wife's infidelity like some second-rate detective. But that's exactly where I found myself one Saturday afternoon. It had started with a name, Eric. I didn't know much about him at first. Hell, I didn't even know what he looked like. But his name was enough to set me on edge. Eric. A simple name. Ordinary. But to me, it had become a flashing red siren, a warning that everything I thought I knew about my life was unraveling. I'd first heard it weeks earlier, mentioned in passing during one of Claire's work stories. She'd been talking about a new colleague, someone from out of state who had joined her team. Eric this, Eric that. At the time, it didn't register as anything out of the ordinary. I mean, people talk about coworkers all the time. But as the weeks went on, his name kept coming up. Eric had the best idea for the campaign. Eric said something hilarious at lunch. It wasn't just what she said. It was the way she said it. There was a warmth in her tone, an energy I hadn't heard in months, maybe longer. I started noticing changes in her behavior, too. She'd linger at her computer late into the evening, her fingers tapping away at the keyboard. When I asked what she was working on, she'd brush it off. Just wrapping up some notes from a meeting, she'd say. I didn't press her, but the unease settled in the pit of my stomach like a rock. The first time I saw Eric's face, it was on her phone. Claire had left it on the kitchen counter while she stepped out to grab something from the car. A notification lit up the screen. An email, the subject line reading, "Great idea from earlier." Beneath it was his name, Eric S. I shouldn't have done it, but I couldn't stop myself. I opened the email. The message was professional enough on the surface, filled with marketing jargon and talk of campaign strategy. But there was an ease in the way they communicated, a familiarity that didn't sit right with me. He'd signed off with, "Can't wait to see what you come up with. You're incredible at this." I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe he was just one of those overly complimentary types. But it wasn't long before the pieces started to come together. Through a mix of late-night Google searches and casual conversations, I learned more about him than I cared to know. Eric was everything I wasn't. Sleek, modern, progressive. He worked out regularly and drove a hybrid. He probably had a collection of fair trade coffee blends and knew how to pronounce quinoa without sounding like an idiot. And then there was the contraception thing. Claire and I had been at odds over birth control for years, a constant tug-of-war that neither of us could seem to win. I believed in letting nature take its course. Claire didn't. It had driven a wedge between us, one that Eric seemed more than willing to fill. I imagined their conversations, the way he must have listened to her frustrations and offered her a different perspective. "That must be so hard for you," he'd probably say, his voice smooth and understanding. "You deserve to feel safe and in control." I hated him for it. But more than that, I hated the part of me that understood why she was drawn to him. Eric was the opposite of me in every way that mattered. Where I was stubborn, he was flexible. Where I clung to tradition, he embraced change. And where I had failed to make Claire feel heard, he had stepped in and done exactly that. I started having flashbacks to moments with Claire, little things that now seemed tinged with an entirely different meaning. Like the time she'd come home with a new haircut, lighter and shorter than she'd ever worn it before. "Just felt like a change," she'd said, but now I wondered if it was for him. Or the time we'd fought about something stupid, who knows what, and she'd stormed out of the house. She came back hours later, calmer but distant. Had she gone to him then? The worst part was that I couldn't even blame her entirely. Don't get me wrong, I was furious. The thought of her with another man made my blood boil. But I couldn't ignore the role I'd played in pushing her away. In my quieter moments, I thought about how we'd gotten here. I thought about the nights I'd brushed her off when she tried to talk about her feelings, the times I'd let my pride get in the way of compromise. Eric wasn't just a man. He was a symptom of everything that had gone wrong between us. By the time Claire walked through the door that evening, her face flushed from the cold, I felt like a stranger in my own home. She kissed me on the cheek, a casual gesture that used to feel warm and reassuring but now felt hollow. "Long day?" I asked, my voice neutral. She nodded, dropping her bag by the door. "Yeah, same old stuff." I watched her walk into the kitchen, her heels clicking against the tile. The scent of her perfume lingered in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of coffee and cinnamon. I wondered if Eric liked the way she smelled, too. This chapter explores the narrator's growing awareness of Eric as a direct contrast to himself, blending his anger, jealousy, and self-reflection in a way that feels raw and relatable. Would you like me to continue this thread, or explore another chapter? The moment she said she had another work dinner, I felt the knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't just her words. It was her tone, her body language. She was overly casual, almost too eager to brush past it. Like if she didn't give me time to ask questions, I wouldn't think twice about it. But I was already thinking twice about everything she said. I kept my cool, nodding like I always did, even throwing in a "don't work too hard" for good measure. But as soon as she left, my mind was racing. I couldn't keep sitting in the dark, wondering, questioning, doubting. This time, I needed answers. I waited 15 minutes after she left, long enough to not look suspicious if she doubled back for something. Then I grabbed my coat and keys and followed her. I know what you're thinking. It's pathetic, right? Stalking my own wife like some desperate, paranoid loser. And maybe I was. But at that point, I didn't care. All I cared about was finding the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. She drove downtown, and I kept a safe distance, my palms sweaty against the steering wheel. She pulled into the parking lot of an upscale restaurant, the kind we hadn't been to in years. I parked a block away and watched as she got out of the car, smoothing down her dress and checking her reflection in the window. She looked incredible, hair styled perfectly, makeup done just enough to highlight her natural beauty. It hit me then how much effort she put into this dinner, more than she ever did for the rare date nights we managed to squeeze into our schedules. And then I saw him, Eric. He stepped out of a silver BMW, dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. He smiled as he walked toward her, and she lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. They didn't touch, not yet, but the way she leaned toward him, the way her laugh carried across the parking lot, told me everything I needed to know. I stayed in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to storm over there, to rip him apart and demand she tell me the truth. But another part of me, the part that still hoped I was wrong, held me back. I waited until they went inside before following. The restaurant was dimly lit, the kind of place where every table had a candle and a wine list longer than the dinner menu. I spotted them immediately, seated at a cozy table in the back corner. She was laughing at something he said, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, just close enough to his to make it seem like an accident. I don't remember deciding to confront them. One second, I was standing by the entrance, and the next, I was walking toward their table, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. "Enjoying your dinner?" I said, my voice loud enough to turn a few heads. Claire's face went pale as she looked up at me. Eric froze, his smile disappearing in an instant. "John," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" I repeated, the words dripping with sarcasm. "Funny, I was about to ask you the same thing." Eric stood, his hands raised slightly, like he was trying to calm the situation. "Look, man, this isn't what it looks like." "Don't," I snapped, cutting him off. "Don't you dare insult my intelligence by pretending this is innocent." Claire reached for my arm, her touch meant to placate me, but it only made me angrier. "John, let's talk about this somewhere else. Please." "Why?" I said, shaking her off. "So you can lie to me some more? Tell me, Claire, how long has this been going on? Weeks? Months?" She didn't answer, her eyes darting between me and Eric like she was trying to decide which fire to put out first. Eric, meanwhile, took a step back, his face tight with unease. "I think I should go," he said, his voice calm but tense. "Yeah," I said, stepping toward him. "I think you should too. Before I make you." For a second, it looked like he might stand his ground, but then he glanced at Claire and seemed to think better of it. He turned and walked out of the restaurant, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. I followed him outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. He was heading toward his car, moving quickly but not running. "Eric," I called after him. He stopped but didn't turn around. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice steady but low. "Too late for that," I said, my fists clenched at my sides. "You've already caused enough trouble." He didn't respond, just got into his car and drove off, leaving me standing there, seething with rage. When I went back inside, Claire was still at the table, her face buried in her hands. She didn't look up as I sat down across from her. "Talk," I said, my voice cold and flat. But she didn't. Not then. And by the time we left the restaurant, the silence between us was louder than any argument we'd ever had. This chapter captures the raw emotion of John's confrontation with Claire and Eric, building tension and leaving readers eager to know what happens next. Would you like me to continue with the aftermath? I've always thought of myself as a reasonable man, the kind who keeps his cool, who doesn't let emotions take the wheel. But that night? That night, something inside me snapped. After Eric bolted from the restaurant, I couldn't just let him leave. Not after everything I'd seen, everything I'd pieced together. I needed answers, and if Claire wasn't going to give them to me, I sure as hell wasn't going to let Eric walk away without some accountability. I caught sight of his silver BMW as it pulled out of the parking lot. Without thinking, I ran to my truck, slamming the door so hard the sound echoed in the empty lot. My hands were trembling as I shoved the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life like it was feeding off my anger. He had a head start, but his taillights were still in view. I peeled out of the lot, tires screeching against the asphalt, and barreled down the street after him. The thought crossed my mind, fleeting and distant, that this was reckless, dangerous, even, but my anger drowned it out. I couldn't let him get away. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional late-night driver. He weaved through traffic with ease, like he'd done this before. I stayed close, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The truck was heavier, less agile than his BMW, but it had power, and I wasn't about to lose him. The city lights blurred as we sped through intersections, the traffic signals nothing more than suggestions. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I wasn't thinking about what I'd do if I caught him. All I knew was that I couldn't let him slip away into the night, taking my sanity with him. He made a sharp turn onto a narrower street, barely slowing down. I followed, the tires skidding slightly as I tried to keep up. The road was darker here, the glow of the city fading into shadows. I could see him up ahead, his car sleek and fast, but he wasn't gaining distance. If anything, I was getting closer. For a moment, I thought I had him. The road curved sharply, and he had to slow down to navigate it. I closed the gap, the distance between us shrinking until I could make out the shine of his license plate. But then, he made another turn, this time onto an even smaller side street. I cursed under my breath, slamming on the brakes and cranking the wheel to follow. The truck groaned in protest, the tires struggling to grip the uneven pavement. The street was quiet, lined with old brick buildings and parked cars. He was ahead, his taillights glowing like twin beacons in the dark. I pushed the truck harder, the engine roaring as I tried to catch up. And then, just like that, he was gone. One moment, his car was in view. The next, it disappeared around another corner. By the time I turned onto the same street, it was empty. No sign of his BMW, no hint of where he'd gone. I slammed my hands against the steering wheel, the sound loud and hollow in the confined space of the truck. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest tight with frustration. He'd gotten away. I sat there for a moment, the engine idling as I tried to process what had just happened. The anger was still there, burning beneath the surface, but now it was mixed with something else. A sense of helplessness, of futility. I couldn't shake the image of him sitting across from Claire at that restaurant, his smug smile, the way she laughed at his jokes like I didn't even exist. The rage bubbled up again, hot and suffocating, but there was nowhere for it to go. I took a deep breath, gripping the wheel until the leather creaked under my hands. Then, slowly, I turned the truck around and headed home. The drive back was quiet, the streets empty and still. My mind raced, replaying the events of the night over and over again, searching for something I'd missed. But no matter how many times I turned it over, the result was the same. Eric was gone, and I was left with more questions than answers. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. Claire's car was there, parked neatly in its usual spot. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at the house that had once felt like a haven, a place of comfort and love. Now, it felt like a stranger's home. I finally got out of the truck, my legs heavy as I made my way inside. The air was thick with silence, the kind that presses down on you, making it hard to breathe. Claire was in the living room, sitting on the couch with her arms wrapped around herself. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes red and puffy. "John." "Don't," I said, cutting her off. My voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made her flinch. "Not tonight." I didn't wait for her response. I went upstairs, shutting the door to the bedroom behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, the events of the night replaying in my mind like a broken record. I didn't know what I was going to do, how I was going to move forward from this. All I knew was that I couldn't let it end here. Not like this. This chapter captures the raw tension and desperation of the narrator's pursuit of Eric, blending adrenaline-fueled action with deep emotional conflict. Let me know if you'd like to continue. When I walked into the house that night, the silence hit me harder than anything Claire could have said. It wasn't the kind of silence that came with peace or quiet. No, this was the weighty, suffocating kind. The kind that made you feel like the walls were closing in. She was sitting on the couch, her legs curled up beneath her, staring at her phone like it was the only thing holding her together. The faint glow from the lamp on the end table cast her in soft light, but there was nothing soft about the tension in the room. I closed the door behind me, the sound echoing louder than it should have. I kicked off my shoes, more out of habit than anything, and walked to the middle of the room, standing there like a man waiting for a verdict. "John!" Her voice broke the silence, but not the tension. She set her phone down, her hands folding nervously in her lap. "I know we need to talk." No kidding, I thought. But instead of saying that, I sat down in the armchair across from her, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees. I didn't know where to start. My mind was still reeling from the chase, from seeing her with Eric, from the months of doubt and suspicion that had been building to this point. "Start talking," I finally said, my voice low and steady. She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the silver band on her ring finger. That simple motion made my chest tighten. I used to love seeing that ring on her, the way it symbolized everything we'd built together. Now, it felt like a mockery. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There it was. No excuses, no deflection. Just the truth, raw and unfiltered. "For how long?" I asked, keeping my tone as calm as I could manage. "A few months," she admitted. "It wasn't supposed to go this far, John. I swear, I didn't." "Don't," I interrupted. "Don't say you didn't mean it. You don't accidentally have an affair, Claire. You don't just trip and fall into someone else's bed." She flinched at my words, but I didn't feel bad. She needed to hear it, and I needed to say it. "I felt like I was drowning," she said, her voice shaking. Every conversation we had turned into a fight. About kids, about work, about everything. I couldn't breathe, John. And then Eric. "Don't say his name," I snapped, the anger bubbling up despite my efforts to hold it back. She nodded, swallowing hard. "He listened. He made me feel heard. Like I mattered." That stung more than anything else she could have said. I wanted to yell, to tell her she did matter, that I'd spent years trying to be everything she needed. But deep down, I knew that wasn't entirely true. The cracks in our marriage hadn't appeared overnight. They'd been forming for years, small fissures that we both ignored until they became too big to ignore anymore. I thought about the arguments we'd had about contraception, the nights we'd gone to bed angry, the times I'd brushed off her concerns because I was too stubborn to admit she might be right. "I'm not saying what I did was okay," Claire continued. "It wasn't. But I need you to understand why." "I don't want to hear your excuses," I said, cutting her off. "I don't care why you did it. You could have talked to me, Claire. You could have told me you were unhappy, that you needed more from me. But instead, you chose to lie, to cheat." "I tried," she said, her voice rising for the first time. "I tried to talk to you, but you never listened. Every time I brought up how I felt, you shut me down. Do you know how lonely that was?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Part of me wanted to deny it, to argue that she was wrong. But I couldn't, because she wasn't wrong. I leaned back in the chair, running a hand through my hair as I tried to process everything she was saying. I wanted to be angry, to blame her for all of it. But the truth was, I wasn't blameless. I'd been so caught up in my own pride, my own beliefs about what marriage should be, that I hadn't seen what it was becoming. "Do you love him?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She hesitated, and that hesitation was answer enough. "I don't know," she said finally. "I don't think so. But I know I don't want to lose you, John. I know I still love you." Her words should have comforted me, but they didn't. How could she love me and betray me at the same time? How could I trust her again after this? "I need time," I said, standing up and grabbing my jacket. "Where are you going?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. "I don't know," I admitted. I can't be here right now." I walked out the door, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I didn't know where I was going or what I was going to do. All I knew was that the life I thought I had was gone, shattered by the truth we'd both ignored for too long. This chapter brings the emotional turmoil to a head, revealing the depth of their problems while leaving room for reflection and uncertainty. Would you like me to explore how John begins to process his emotions in the next chapter? It's been 3 weeks since the night I walked out of the house. 3 weeks of silence, of circling around the edges of a decision I never thought I'd have to make. Each day feels heavier than the last, the weight of it pressing down on me like a storm cloud that refuses to break. I stayed at a friend's place at first, a buddy from college who didn't ask too many questions. He didn't need to. He could tell just by looking at me that I was wrecked. The couch was lumpy. The air always smelled faintly of pizza and beer, but it was a place to crash while I tried to get my head straight. Claire called the first night, then the second, leaving voicemails that I couldn't bring myself to listen to. She texted, too, long messages full of apologies, promises, and questions that I didn't have the energy to answer. I read them, then deleted them, over and over again. I wasn't angry anymore, at least not in the same way I'd been that night. The rage had burned itself out, leaving behind something colder, quieter. I couldn't tell if it was sadness or just exhaustion. Maybe both. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted. Some days, I thought about forgiving her, about going back and trying to rebuild what we had, piece by shattered piece. Other days, the idea of being in the same room as her made my chest tighten with anger and hurt. The thought of her with Eric, of everything they'd done behind my back, felt like a wound that would never heal. I spent hours replaying our conversations, our arguments, searching for the moment it all went wrong. Was it the fight about kids? The nights I stayed late at work instead of coming home to her? The times I let my pride win instead of listening? I kept coming back to the same question. Was it all my fault? And then there was Claire. I could picture her in the house, sitting on the same couch where we used to watch movies, staring at her phone and wondering if I was ever coming back. Part of me hated the thought of her feeling lonely, abandoned. But another part of me couldn't forget that she'd chosen this. She'd made the decision to betray me, to put our marriage on the line for someone else. I finally agreed to meet her last night. She suggested a neutral place, a coffee shop a few miles from the house. It was busy but not loud, the kind of place where you could disappear into the background if you needed to. She looked different when she walked in. Her hair was pulled back, her makeup subdued, like she was trying to look more like the Claire I'd fallen in love with and less like the woman I'd seen with Eric. She spotted me right away, hesitating for a moment before walking over to the table. "Hi," she said, her voice soft, almost unsure. "Hi." We sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the cafe filling the space between us. Finally, she spoke. "Thank you for meeting me," she said. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything yet. "John, I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I hurt you, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I need you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this. Counseling, therapy, anything." Her words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. But I couldn't ignore the doubt gnawing at the back of my mind. "Why now?" I asked. "Why is it only after you got caught that you're willing to do the work?" She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the edge of a napkin. "Because I was scared. I didn't want to admit how bad things had gotten between us. And when I did, I didn't know how to fix it. So, I took the coward's way out. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was honest. And that, at least, was something. I don't know if I can trust you again," I said. "I don't even know if I want to." "I understand," she said, her voice breaking. I needed you to know that I'm not giving up on us, even if you decide to." We sat there for a while longer, not saying much. By the time we left, nothing had been resolved, but the weight in my chest felt a little lighter. Now, as I sit here writing this, I'm still at that fork in the road. One path leads back to Claire, to months, maybe years, of rebuilding and wondering if we can ever truly recover. The other leads away from her, to a fresh start, to a life where I'm not constantly looking over my shoulder or questioning everything she says. I don't know which path I'll take. All I know is that, for the first time in weeks, I feel like I have a choice.